All right, ready to dive deep into some philosophy today. We're going to untangle this whole concept of intrinsic versus extrinsic value, and our guide is going to be the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the S&P.
It's a good one, a classic. So, it really makes you think about what we value in life and why. It's not just an academic debate, it's something we grapple with every day.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm always struggling with. What is really valuable? What should I prioritize? So maybe we should start with the basics just to make sure we're all on the same page. Remind me, what exactly is intrinsic value again?
Well, intrinsic value is all about something's inherent worth. Like it's valuable just for being what it is, not for what it can get you or what it can do.
Okay, that makes sense. So like if you have a beautiful painting, it's beautiful just because it is, right?
Yeah.
Not because you can sell it or anything.
Right, exactly. Its value doesn't depend on anything outside of itself. It's not about its usefulness or its potential to bring you something else.
So it's not like money. Money's only valuable because of what you can buy with it,
Yeah.
right?
Precisely. Money is a classic example of extrinsic value. Its worth is tied to its ability to get you things that might actually have intrinsic value, like experiences or relationships.
Hmm. This is already making me rethink my shopping habits. Maybe I'm too focused on extrinsic value. But I guess that's a topic for another day.
Yeah.
So the ST particle mentions that this debate about intrinsic and extrinsic value goes way back, like all the way to Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah, it's one of those perennial philosophical questions. These thinkers were trying to figure out what makes something truly good or valuable. And, Plato believed that pleasure was intrinsically good while pain was intrinsically bad.
Okay, yeah, the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah.
Didn't Aristotle sort of agree with him on that?
He did to a certain extent, but for Aristotle it was more nuanced. He talked about this idea of eudaimonia, often translated as flourishing or living well. And for him, it wasn't just about chasing pleasure, it was about living a virtuous and fulfilling life.
So it's like, it's not just about feeling good, it's about living a good life.
Right, exactly. The quality of the experience matters. Now, if you want a contrasting view, look at hedonism. Thinkers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill believed that the only things with intrinsic value were pleasure and the absence of pain.
That seems so, simple. Is that really all there is to it?
Well, it's a straightforward approach, but it raises a lot of questions. Is pleasure really the ultimate good? Are there other things we value for their own sake, even if they don't necessarily bring us pleasure? That's where thinkers like William Frankena come in.
Okay, what did Frankena have to say about this?
Well, Frankena challenged that whole idea that pleasure is the only intrinsic good. He came up with this big list of potential intrinsic goods. It was pretty comprehensive, covering all sorts of things.
Wow, I'm curious, what kind of things did he include on this list?
Oh, he included things like life, consciousness, health, happiness, obviously, but also knowledge, beauty, moral virtue, even a good reputation. He really went all out.
That is a pretty impressive list. Anything on there that stood out to you?
I thought it was interesting that he included environmental preservation. It's a big topic today, and Frankena seemed to suggest that the well-being of the natural world might have intrinsic value, not just value because it's useful to humans.
That's a really thought-provoking idea. So we've got this long list of potential intrinsic goods, but the SCP article points out that it's not enough just to list things, right? We have to go deeper.
Right. That's where things get really interesting. We need to define what intrinsic value actually is. How can we even wrap our minds around it? And that's where G.E. Moore comes in. He was a big name in ethics, and he struggled with this very question.
Oh yeah, Moore. I vaguely remember reading about his isolation test in a philosophy class years ago. Can you remind me what that was all about?
Absolutely. Moore argued that intrinsic goodness couldn't be defined in terms of anything else. It was a basic, unanalyzable property. And his isolation test was this thought experiment he used to illustrate that. So imagine something existing all by itself, totally isolated from everything else. Would it still be good?
Okay, so let's say there's a world with nothing but happiness. No knowledge, no love, no beauty, just pure bliss. Would Moore say that world is good simply because it's full of happiness?
He actually thought that was absurd. He believed a world with knowledge, love, and beauty, even if it had a bit less happiness, would be a better world. For Moore, intrinsic goodness was something more than just pleasure or desire.
So he's saying intrinsic value is objective, like it's in the things themselves, not just in our heads.
Exactly. And that brings up another big question. What kinds of things can actually have intrinsic value? I mean, if it exists, where do we find it?
Yeah, Moore wasn't too picky, was he? He talked about objects having intrinsic value, like a book. but also states of affairs, like someone being happy and even just the existence of things.
He covered a lot of ground, and that's what leads us to this debate between monists and pluralists, which delves into the very nature of what exists, the realm of ontology.
Right. Ontology, the study of being. I remember that from my philosophy, 101 Days.
So the monists believe there is only one type of thing that can have intrinsic value. Some might say it's only properties, like courage or beauty. Others might say it's states of affairs, like someone being healthy. And then there are those who say it's facts, like the fact that a certain species exists.
Okay, and the pluralists are basically saying, hey, why can't it be all of the above, like a big buffet of intrinsic goodness?
Exactly. Now, within the monist camp, things get even more specific. Some argue that it can't just be any old property or state of affairs, it has to be the most basic fundamental ones. That's where the idea of basic intrinsic value comes in.
Right, basic intrinsic value. Can you explain that a bit more? It sounds pretty complex.
Think of it like a really good meal. It might have ingredients that are good in themselves, like fresh veggies or perfectly cooked meat. The idea is that the basic intrinsic value lies in those individual ingredients, those building blocks of goodness.
So each ingredient brings its own goodness to the table, and the overall goodness of the meal is determined by that.
Right, but it's not always a simple calculation. That's where Moore's principle of organic unities comes into play. Remember that one.
Vaguely. It's something about the value of a whole being, more than just the sum of its parts, right?
You got it. Think of a friendship. Each person brings their own qualities and values, but the friendship itself creates something new and valuable that's more than just the two individuals combined.
So it's not just about the ingredients, it's about how they interact and create something unique.
Exactly. And that's what makes intrinsic value so tricky to pin down. It's not always a straightforward equation, and that's just intrinsic value. It gets even more complicated when you start thinking about how it relates to extrinsic value. I mean, we were just talking about how hard it is to figure out what has intrinsic worth and how much of it there is.
Yeah, it's a lot to wrap your head around.
Ugh.
But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, I'm still stuck on something we were talking about earlier, the whole idea of whether extrinsic value can even exist without intrinsic value. Did we ever figure that out?
You know, that's a question that philosophers have been debating for a long time. It makes sense, right? If something's value comes from something else, that something else has to be valuable in the first place. Otherwise, what's the point?
I get that, but I feel like there are some tricky situations where it gets blurry. Like, what about inherent value, where something is valuable because it could lead to something intrinsically good, even if that good thing doesn't actually exist yet?
Ah, yes, the classic case of the undiscovered masterpiece hidden away in an attic. It's a perfect example of how tricky this relationship can be.
Right. Imagine if that painting gets destroyed before anyone ever sees it. Was it really valuable even though no one ever got to experience the intrinsic good of appreciating its beauty?
That's the crux of the debate. Some philosophers would argue that the potential for goodness, the possibility of someone experiencing that joy, is enough to give it a kind of value, even if it never actually comes to be.
So it's like a phantom limb of value, lingering even after the source is gone.
That's a great way to put it. Now, the Seppi article also brings up the view that all value, in the end, has to come back to intrinsic value. It's like a big circle.
So even those really long chains of extrinsic value, where one thing leads to another and another, they all eventually have to trace back to something that's intrinsically good, kind of like a treasure map, where each clue is only valuable because it gets you closer to the actual treasure.
Exactly. Each step along the way derives its worth from that ultimate goal, that treasure at the end, which represents the intrinsic value. But even that view gets challenged in the article.
Really? How so?
Well, think about something like a medical test that shows you're in perfect health, or taking an aspirin that stops a headache before it even starts.
Yeah, those are things we usually consider good.
But they're not actually causing something intrinsically good to exist. The medical test just confirms that you're already healthy, and the aspirin prevents something intrinsically bad, the pain, from happening in the first place.
So it seems like extrinsic value can actually stand on its own sometimes, without needing intrinsic value to back it up.
It's a possibility worth considering. It seems the more we dig into these concepts, the more nuanced they become. Which brings us to another big challenge. How do we measure intrinsic value? I mean, if something is intrinsically good, how do we know how good it is?
Right, because saying this is good is one thing, but how do we say this is really good or this is way better than that? Is there some kind of philosophical ruler we can use to measure goodness?
If only it were that easy. The article highlights a few major obstacles that make measuring intrinsic value almost impossible. It's a real head scratcher.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are these obstacles?
Well, the first one is what philosophers call intransitivity when comparing intrinsic value. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's a crucial concept.
Okay, I'm going to need a little help with that one. What does intransitivity mean when we're talking about value?
Basically, it means that even if we say A is better than B and B is better than C, it doesn't automatically mean that A is better than C. It's not a simple linear ranking.
Wait, really? That doesn't seem right. It feels like it should be straightforward.
I know, it seems counterintuitive. But some philosophers argue that this can happen when we're dealing with intrinsic value. Think about it. You might say that spending time with loved ones is better than pursuing your passion, and pursuing your passion is better than helping strangers.
But does that mean you'd always choose spending time with loved ones over helping strangers? I mean, those values can sometimes clash, right? It's not always a clear hierarchy.
Exactly. And that makes it really hard to create a neat and tidy ranking of what's intrinsically good.
So that's obstacle number one. What else makes it so difficult to measure intrinsic value?
The second obstacle is this idea of incommensurate values.
Incommensurate, what does that even mean?
It essentially means that some values can't be directly compared because they're just so different. It's like trying to compare apples and oranges. They belong to different categories.
So you're saying there are some things that are so different we can't even say which one is better?
That's the argument. W.D. Ross, a famous philosopher, said that you couldn't compare the goodness of pleasure with the goodness of virtue, for example. They're just different kinds of good, so a direct comparison is meaningless.
That's interesting. So it's not always a simple ranking. It's like trying to say whether a beautiful sunset is better than a delicious meal. They both have value, but it's hard to compare them directly.
Hmm.
Okay, so we've got intransitivity and incommensurability. Was there a third obstacle you mentioned?
Yes, that would be Moore's principle of organic unities, which we were discussing earlier.
The whole is greater than the sum of its parts idea.
Exactly. And that throws another wrench into our attempts to measure intrinsic value because it suggests that the goodness of a whole might be totally different from, and not just a combination of, the goodness of its parts.
So even if we could somehow figure out the basic intrinsic value of each individual piece, we still wouldn't know the value of the whole thing. Kind of frustrating.
Very much so. And to illustrate this, the ASEP article uses the example of combining two pleasing tunes. You'd think putting two good things together would create something even better, but that's not always the case in music.
It's like when you try to mix your two favorite songs together. Sometimes it works, but sometimes it's a total train wreck.
Exactly. The same principle applies to intrinsic value. Sometimes the whole is just different, not necessarily better or worse, just different. So as you can see, calculating intrinsic value is a pretty tricky business.
Yeah, it seems like it's almost impossible.
Yeah.
Have any philosophers actually managed to come up with a way to measure it?
Some are still trying. They're working on systems to calculate intrinsic value, often using the concept of basic intrinsic value as a starting point.
So they're trying to find the prime numbers of goodness, the fundamental building blocks of everything else.
That's a great way to put it. But of course, not everyone agrees with this approach. Some philosophers, called particularists, embrace the idea that value is complex and depends on the context.
So they're saying that instead of looking for some universal formula, we should focus on how value works in specific situations.
Exactly. They argue that intrinsic value can change from one context to another, that it's fluid and dynamic, kind of like the patterns in a kaleidoscope, always shifting.
This whole conversation is making me realize how much I take the concept of value for granted. It's way more complicated than I thought.
It's a good reminder that even the most basic ideas, like what's good or valuable, are often full of nuances and open to different interpretations.
So, wow, we've really gone deep into these ideas of intrinsic and extrinsic value. I feel like I'm seeing the world in a whole new way, but I'm still wondering, what does all this mean for me, for the average person listening? Why should I care about all these philosophical distinctions?
That's a really important question. I mean, it's easy to get lost in the weeds of philosophical concepts, but, understanding this difference between intrinsic and extrinsic value, it can actually have a big impact on how we live our lives.
I can see that. It's definitely making me think about what I prioritize, what's really important to me.
Right. Think about it. We make so many choices every day, big and small. What kind of career do I want? How do I spend my time? Who do I want to be friends with? What do I believe in? And all these choices reflect what we value, even if we don't realize it.
So if we only focus on extrinsic value, like what things can do for us or get us, are we missing out on something?
We might be. I mean, you might end up chasing those fleeting pleasures or material possessions or status symbols, things that don't really bring lasting fulfillment.
But if we learn to appreciate intrinsic value, the inherent worth of things, that could lead us to make different choices. Yeah.
Exactly. We might find ourselves drawn to deeper, more meaningful things, pursuing personal growth, building strong relationships, giving back to our communities, or even just appreciating the beauty around us.
Yeah, those things seem so much more fulfilling in the long run.
I think so. And you know, what's really interesting is that even those who don't believe intrinsic value exists still have to deal with these concepts. It's inescapable.
Wait, really? How so? If someone doesn't believe in intrinsic value, wouldn't they just focus on extrinsic value?
It's not that straightforward. Even if you reject the idea of some objective, inherent goodness in things, you still have to make choices about what matters to you, what's worth striving for.
So even without using the label intrinsic, they're still operating within some kind of value system.
Exactly. They might talk about their preferences or societal norms or practical outcomes, but ultimately they're still expressing what they find valuable. It's just a different way of framing it.
So it seems like we can't avoid these big questions about value, no matter what we believe. It's something we all have to grapple with.
It really is, and that's what makes it so fascinating to explore. It's not about finding the right answer, it's about understanding the complexity of what it means to live a good life. A life that's meaningful and aligned with our values.
This whole deep dive has given me a lot to think about. I'm going to be looking at the world in a different way now, and hopefully making choices that reflect what I truly value.
Well, that's what we hope for. It's not just about defining terms, it's about sparking new ideas and questioning our assumptions. That's what makes it a real deep dive.
So, keep those minds working, listeners, and until next time, keep diving deep.